Well, hello everyone to the atomic, bombastic, totally nuclear CM Kozeman Oppenheimer review special. Yes, everyone, this is CM Kozeman broadcasting from a totally nuclear 30-degree temperature wave hellhole to my American viewers. That's like 86-ish something F out here. And it's a very hot day, and I'm just back from a nightly screening of Oppenheimer. And let's talk about this interesting film because, well, it was one of the few films I recently liked these days. And, well, without much ado, let's go. But just before beginning, if you're just here for the movie review and if you're just new to this channel, always know that this is an interesting, eccentric channel where we talk about many interesting, weird and unusual things from an extraordinary perspective, let's say. And if you're joining us just for this review, please consider subscribing and clicking the little goddamn bell icon, cause the algorithm likes it better that way, I guess. Also, please consider leaving a comment. All of these things really help a lot in the algorithm for this channel. And of course, like nuclear programs, ice cream stands, cars, pens, caps, and all sorts of shit under the sun, this channel does not run free, and I would really like it if you could leave a donation to me on the Patreon link or the Buy Me a Coffee link. The links are in the video description. Also, there's a merch store where you can go and get interesting CM Kozeman merchandise. If that's your bag of stuff, also consider getting that. Remember, I am doing this in the side of my day job out there, and every penny makes a difference. Okay, with the introduction out of the way, let's go. Yeah, just a second. I'm eating some cool slices of peach in the meantime. Just getting that down there. Yeah. Alright, so the movie directed by Christopher Nolan, and when they announced this film was coming out, I honestly had some mixed feelings. Christopher Nolan is a technically very adept filmmaker. There's no denying that. He's a great director. He has some great cinematography skills, and his thing for doing everything in real effects is like very extraordinary in today's film effect and film world in general. But this being said, in my humble opinion, he also has some deficiencies when it comes to, well, simple matters of humanity, really. If you watch some of Nolan's films like Inception and Tenet, you really see that he kind of overfixates on details and a like weird convoluted storyline, or that's a dream in a dream and a dream, and so complicated. And he sometimes overfixates on this like really trope-like worlds of like basically men wearing sharp suits and being smart. And well, that's okay if there's a story at hand, but you notice in films like Tenet and Inception that it can really like go out of control. Basically, it serves as a vehicle for quite empty, mind-bamboozling effect scenes, some exciting chase scenes, and then a lot of scenes where like men just walk around and be smart, basically. So that aspect of Nolan I always found inhuman, and in fact I always believed that it was the late Heath Ledger who saved his career when he made that Batman movie with Joker in it, The Dark Knight. And that movie is a straight-up masterpiece, but I think it's mostly due to Heath Ledger's phenomenal performance there. So that's one thing to note. If it hadn't been for that film, in my opinion, Nolan would have been a niche director and would not have been a Hollywood household name that he is today. But then again, in some other films like Dunkirk, he also did some like nice storytelling, I must say. But it seems like his storytelling reflex works best if there's already a story written for him, or if he's working for history and, let us say, maybe a nobler cause. I remember when he was talking about the Dunkirk film, for example, he was basically, somebody gave him a book about the Dunkirk evacuation, and he wanted to do something to honor the memory of that event. So he up and went and made Dunkirk, which again is a very nice film, but falls slightly short of what I would call a great film. Anyways, all these being said, I was kind of scared that Oppenheimer would have been a kind of like edgy film about like almost people cosplaying as Jordan Peterson, you know, wearing really sharp clothing, sitting around in really like sharp office furniture, lots of oak furniture, and saying lots of great stuff and making history and stuff like this. Fortunately, that did not come to pass, and I think that's mostly due to the book that was the origin for this film, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. And to my credit, I bought and read this book in 2015, back before anybody around me knew who Oppenheimer was, and I was really taken by how just well written and well researched this book was. The authors, the names are, I think, Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. They really this is how all autobiographies should be written, this is how all biographies should be written, because Oppenheimer is no longer around to write his autobiography. They really went and did all the research. They cite all their sources. They have all these interviews and every little event in Oppenheimer's life and every little event which you will see in this film, including that bit where he's in the kitchen and some communist sympathizer guy asks him if you could spy about things. Every bit of research for these key scenes in the film were basically made by these authors for this book. And not only is their book very well researched, it's also very well put together. You really have a sense of story following this person's life. And if you know anything about real life, a sense of story is mostly absent in most people's lives. But with Oppenheimer's biography, American Prometheus, and I really think you should go get this book. I'm actually going to put it in the pinned comment, so go get and read it. I would dare say that even with the film being as great as it is, the book is a better story about Oppenheimer than the movie, and I really recommend it. In fact, if you like this film like I did, go get this book right away. What are you waiting for? So it's almost like a beat-by-beat adaptation of the book, where I'm just going to spoil it. Oppenheimer goes and Oppenheims really hard and discovers the theory responsible for black hole formation. He has some troubled teenage years, tries to poison his teacher. In the movie, he's in a lab and the teacher is kind of being an asshole to him. So he goes takes potassium cyanide and injects it into an apple. The next day he wakes up and quickly grabs the apple and says oh, wormholes. And it's of course an in-joke. It's wormholes are also kind of a cosmic travel thing, which as a side note reminds me of Interstellar, the really awful other film by Nolan. When you first watch Interstellar, you're like, wow, space and shit. Books falling out of the bookshelf, teleport shit. And then you go out of the cinema, have a couple of days, busy yourself with work and whatnot. Then you go back and think about it. That movie was kind of bullshit. And it was really the Hans Zimmer soundtrack that sold it to many people. And yeah, the effects were really nice. And there was the whole walking Jacko Bumble rotary monolith robot. That was cool. But if you look at the whole story, the story was kind of a weird mess. There's this guy, it's the future, everybody's bleak and serious, but except for the science people, they're up there sciencing so hard, they have an interstellar trip, they go see black holes and shit. Now, I remember more about the press releases about that film, about how they actually consulted an actual scientist to design the look of the black holes. But then the rest of the movie was kind of a cardboard character playhouse and a story that was really full of loopholes. Not that I care much about loopholes, but the movie pretended so hard that it had a serious story that now your mind was preconditioned to find those loopholes, and find them we did. Anyways, big aside, this was not a movie like Interstellar, and the connection I was making with Oppenheimer was okay, in the movie you see him trying to poison his prof, okay, and he says, oh, wormholes, don't eat the apple, sir, and it's kind of glossed over. In real life, Oppenheimer's parents were really rich fur traders and clothes makers. They were kind of one rung below the ladder from Benetton or somebody from Levi Strauss. They were real haberdashery people who got really well off, by the way. They worked really hard. But in the book, you read that Oppenheimer was kind of afflicted with he was troubled by being just the rich son of a rich clothes seller. So he always tried to rise above, and that kind of explained his theatrical and sometimes pretentious personality. But then, of course, the adage, fake it till you make it. He actually really did make it out there, and kudos on him. I'm not trying to exalt Oppenheimer or tear him down in this review at all. I mean, he was one of the legendary figures of our age. Come to think of it, he was one of the first alchemists. He was one of the first people to transmute an element into another element using the atomic weapon. And to this day, if you go to the atomic test site, the Trinity test site, there's a material there in the glass that was fused by the explosion called trinitite or something similar, or trinitium, and they used to sell these as mementos and curios. They're real radioactive. They're not radioactive enough to hurt you, but anyways, they don't sell them anymore, but they're like an interesting collectible, and they're like a real life result of alchemy, if you think about it. Now, for centuries, sages and wizards sought the secrets of alchemy in trying to transmute lead into gold. In the byproducts, they discovered the ancestral discipline of chemistry, and they also kind of had big contributions to theology and philosophy in all the weird mystical stuff they tried to imbibe their secrets with. But in that respect, Oppenheimer was a real alchemist. He transmuted plutonium into another radioactive element and made it go boom. And before this all began, as I said, he had this kind of class issues in himself. He hated being the rich kid with privileges. But then when he poisoned his professor, actually in real life, it wasn't him catching the apple and like it was a nothing burger. This was noticed, and like he was threatened with expulsion and even as much as like attempted manslaughter. But then his parents stepped in and kind of rescued him from that ordeal, and he apologized and peace was made. So he got out a get out of jail free card. Anyways, the book is full of many details like this that the movie kind of omits. So if you want a better picture of this complicated guy's character, I once again recommend the book really hardly. So what happens? He sciences real hard, then gets drafted for the Manhattan Project. He also was a womanizer and a fellow traveler with American socialists and communists. And, well, I think his political stance is very similar to certain aspect of my politics, where I defend left-wing politics, especially in this day and age, that the state or corporations or both together acting like a disgusting yin-yang hybrid have amassed so much wealth and power that somebody needs to step in and help out the common people. I think one way to do this would be a kind of a great big New Deal kind of statism until the state becomes corrupt again. But in this day and age, there is no difference between the state and the commercial enterprises that kind of live in the shadow of the state. They're one big huge hybrid, and who knows which institution is strong enough to kind of break the back of this power and scatter some windfall to the common people. The more I study the affairs of the world and politics, the more it seems to me that, like, if you go back to things like Marx or Engels, whatever, this is just a religion by another name, and it's just theory that once maybe kinda helped. But remember that the regimes set up by socialism were also very oppressive, and many people living under those regimes in Eastern Europe, they spent their whole life trying to break free of that violent cycle. And the more I study current affairs, the more it seems that the only power that has the potential to break this cycle is the military, I'm afraid. And how is the military going to take up that much power and kind of put the companies and big government into its place? Well, it's going to be through some big-ass war or another protracted Cold War. And that's going to have its ugly sides too. And anyways, that was another big tangent. Remember, in the C.M. Kozeman extended universe, we like taking these wild tangents and exploring these avenues of thought, because if we didn't, well, then it would be just another boring movie review. Anyway, so Oppenheimer lived during a similar age to ours. Unlike many of us, he actually got to head this big-ass Los Alamos project, and he gave humanity, well, atomic weapons, and for this reason he was the American Prometheus, you know? And after that, he gets entangled with a petty political figure called Levi Strauss, who actually, just to double-check this, who actually was another clothes merchant, and he was responsible for the brand, which grew up to be Levi's. Let me just double-check this just in case, you know. Oh, look at this. Levi Strauss, former acting United States Secretary of Commerce. In the movie, he was played by Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. But yeah, he first started out as a shoe wholesaler, and well, he was a really driven person. A bit like Oppenheimer, but an evil twin of Oppenheimer almost. He may not be responsible for the Levi's jeans brand, but he was just a clothes and shoe merchant until he tried to get into politics, much like the way Oppenheimer was the son of a clothes merchant who tried to get into science. And unlike Levi Strauss, he actually made something. And then for reasons known only to himself, Levi Strauss picked Oppenheimer as a mortal enemy and persecuted him in a series of very well executed kind of 4D chess moves executed in the absolute darkest days of the communist witch hunt in the United States. Oppenheimer was disgraced, his permission for scientific research was taken away, and then he was basically, until the last decade of his life, he was kind of an outcast. Then they realized they did a baddie on him and kind of like apologized. I don't know. What you don't see in the movie was that Oppenheimer moved away to one of the Pacific Islands with his then wife, and then in the twilight years of his life, he got into like a really petty dispute with one of the other neighbors on an island. Let me actually dig up my copy of American Prometheus. Just wait. Here we are. Through the book. Just 1 second. Bear with me. Well, I am using a filter to cut out the silences, so you won't have to wait as much as I do. So wait. So he moved to a tiny island called St. John in the Virgin Islands after touring the world, socializing with political figures, but he had little real power. He was a figurehead, and he appeared haunted by the power he had unleashed upon the world. And then basically he had a kind of bad neighbor called Robert Gibney, who was a newspaperman from a wealthy Boston family, and basically they were just like very rude to each other. And this happens like if you ever been on a summer vacation, or heavens forbid if you ever own a summer house, people are looking for every fucking excuse to fight with their neighbors. So one of these like most common, boring, banal finales befell Oppenheimer as well. Then he got old and died. But if you still Google around on YouTube, he still has lectures floating around. Just go on YouTube and Google the Oppenheimer lectures, and he really does sound like a prophet. And I mean, he was someone once characterized Oppenheimer as like, you listen to him speak for hours, you were transfixed, but when the speech was over, you didn't remember a word he said. But he mostly spoke about the need for nuclear disarmament, and he played this kind of sad, kind of crestfallen, morose Jack Skellington character. And then he was actually distinctly the inspiration for pop culture figures such as Dr. Manhattan in the Watchmen series. And I think even like you could argue that the G-Man in Half-Life owes something about his looks to him. Certainly a very influential and a great and somewhat tragic figure. So the movie was really great in portraying him, and there were only like a couple of nitpicks I disliked. One was where basically I think the studio requested this, in order to make the concepts more exciting for the general viewer. Imagine they're speaking about, yes, electrons revolve in several shells around the atomic nucleus. Then suddenly there's like, and there's this like weird, badly done particle effect like, yeah, stars, if they get heavy enough, not even light can escape. Oh no, we can set the atmosphere on fire. This thing like weird animation where like, come on, do you really need that? Come on, who needs that? And there are these like whole montages of Oppenheimer being like, so depressed, and like throwing glasses to the wall, perhaps trying to understand how particles scatter. And those are nice, and these are like harshly intercut with so you know that your character is having a trauma. I guess, it was either the studio or it was Nolan's like inevitable pedantism that did this. But anyway, so you let that fly under the radar. There are also a few scenes where like characters around Oppenheimer almost break the fourth wall and kind of like turn towards the camera and say, oh no, you are too important to lose. And they turn to him like NPCs in a computer game. Oppenheimer, you're the smartest man of our time. And they turn to him and say like, you are the American Prometheus, Oppenheimer. And then it's kind of felt like, well, either it was done to appeal to the me only egos of Gen Z, or the me only egos of studio producers. I don't know. Those scenes really stood up and kind of like felt awkward and weird. And then another gripe I had was with the scene in which he comes up with his tagline, his kick-ass one-liner, I have now become death, the destroyer of worlds. So, like any good scientist, Oppenheimer was wildly erudite about areas outside of his sphere of knowledge. As another tangent, I will state that this is another plague that's afflicting science in general these days, where everybody is hyper-specialized. You hang out with a bird watcher and you say, wow, this was the region where the Battle of Troy happened, and they're all like, I don't care about that. Fuck off. This is a very common melody in our day and age. Not just in the sciences, for everybody. Everybody is hyper specialized. But I think to be knowledgeable, or even forget knowledgeable, to be human, you need to like have an appreciation for everything and all the things at all the time, because it's just not fun any other way. So anyways, backtracking from this side alley again, like many other real scientists and real human beings, let's say, Oppenheimer was widely read about things outside his immediate purview. He read the, I'm going to butcher the spelling, Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu epic, and he quoted from that, "Now I've become death, the destroyer of world." And the popular legend says that he said this upon seeing the first atomic explosion, whereas in the movie, he meets this wild girl, this wild socialist girl, Jean Tatlock, and they flirt really hard. They come back with like snazzy snapbacks at each other, and they're like, you know they're gonna fuck. And they go to their room, and you know, they start making out among the books and shit. Really hot and steamy scene. And suddenly, Jean Tatlock, like, this is one of the another annoying scene where like a historic character pretends to acts like a contemporary character. So she totally breaks character and acts like this IFL science lady and says, "Oh, wait, before I straddle you fully, I have to see which books you read." And they're in the middle of lovemaking, they start talking about books and shit. But look, if you ever really made love, or if you really are into books, you kind of know that it doesn't work that way. Like, you could impress people with your bookshelf and dropping quotes, but that's just for like the minor learner league of amateurs and parvenus, and the relations that start that way don't go anywhere. You arouse people, no matter what sex you are, you arouse people. Okay, knowledge has some part in it. You know, knowing what you're up to or seeming to do that has some part in it. Looks have some part in it. I'm not gonna deny those. But when it comes to like love making and stuff, you know, this approach is a very contemporary one, and it's mostly mediated through shit like Tinder and stuff. You know, you meet someone from Tinder and say, "Oh, let's see what books you have before I bend over the shelf." But yeah, that's not really even erotic at all. But in the film, they do this whole routine. They talk about the books all of a sudden in the middle of intercourse. And then Jean Tatlock picks up the copy of the Bhagavad Gita. "Oh, I bet you can't even know what language this is. I bet you're all pretentious, but Oppenheimer is all real." And he quotes from that, "Now I've become death, the destroyer of world." And she's like, "Daddy, Opie, you really got my juices flowing, but no, read it for real," she says. And then he starts reading in Sanskrit, and she really gets her juices flowing, her gears turning, her noggin jogging, and they make love. But I wasn't in that room. I can confidently state that that's not how that generation flirted. That generation actually was a horny generation. They were, I think, like far more lewd, horny, kinkier than the boomer generation that followed them. The boomers just did the hippie thing, but they were really crass and boring at it. While the generation before them, the generation that Oppenheimer and Jean Tatlock belonged to, for them, sin was best lavished in secrecy. And if you read memoirs of people from that generation, you know they got it on. But it just did not happen in this way. So anyways, I had my gripes with that scene. That took me long to explain, didn't it? But yeah, I really dislike it when suddenly... And this movie has total historic immersion, except for that one detail where the American flags have 50 stars. And, you know, that only happened after Hawaii was a state. And before that, they had 48 stars. I think Alaska and Hawaii were made into states later on. Anyways, but aside from that little detail, the film has amazing immersion. Like, you really feel like you are there, especially if you're watching it in a theater. You are there with these people. You are witnessing these events firsthand. Every detail down from like the wallpaper in the background to how worn the wallpaper is. Like, you really feel like you're there. So it's a shame when in the middle of all this total immersion, characters start acting like Gen Xers or Zoomers or millennials, or act in the kind of weirdly self-centered lead character mentality that only plagues the current generations. Then, you know, it's kind of a letdown. But on the overall, it's a great film. One of my favorite scenes concerns Teller, the die-hard Hungarian scientist who pushed for the development of the hydrogen bomb. And he came up with the theory for that, and like he did most of the heavy lifting and the work on the development of the H-bomb. even after Oppenheimer let go of the project because he didn't want to be part of the hydrogen bomb. He thought it was too dangerous for humanity to have. So Teller took on the lead. And Teller is this, because he escaped a country under communist and at that time ergo Russian domination, he is like a real, like, die-hard, hawkish cold warrior. He knows that Russia cannot be appeased. He knows that the only power they understand, especially in Stalin's day, is the language of power. So he goes all hardcore for the use of atomic weapons and hydrogen weapons. And as another side note, in the slight period of time when only the United States had the atomic weapons, there were actually real campaigns to like nuke Moscow just out of nowhere and just out of principle, really. So they would not risk a longer Cold War in the longer run. These were all fringe voices, but they were like serious people saying these things. So that's like a really dark thing about that day and age. So Teller, being a die-hard cold warrior and an anti-communist and an anti-Russian basically, because he knows what the Russians did to his home country. And let me also like say this as a side note. In the current day and age, there's a war with Russia and Ukraine. I know the way they demonize Russian people, ordinary Russian people, like if they're in a kind of academy for music in Europe, they lose their jobs and stuff. That's just reprehensible. That's just awful. But then again, I also live in a country where more than 80 years ago, the Russians were asking to invade 3 of Turkish provinces, Kars, Ardahan, Erzurum, and they also wanted control of the Straits. So, politically, that's a real risk. But as a human being, I don't like the demonization of ordinary Russian people. I don't know how this conflict will be resolved, so let that be the end of this side tangent. But unlike me, Teller did not have any qualms or scruples about basically where he stood. I think he would have nuked the Russians out of principle if he could. And in the scene where they do blow up the A-bomb for the first time, you see everybody's close-up shots. Oppenheimer is scared and terrified. Everybody's like amazed. One of these guys is like so awestruck he goes out. It's like a biblical scene. But then you look at this guy Teller. He has sunscreen on his face. These like weird-ass soldering glasses to protect against the blast. And as the blast illuminates his face and the wind blows around him, he is just enjoying himself, the fucker, like a right bastard. And I can't prove it, but I bet he's aroused from it too. That was just such a nice kick-ass scene. And like little scenes like this really show a character. And I wish there were more moments like this. So there, on the overall, a great film. And kudos once again to Nolan. He also, like, in documenting the political shitfight and character assassination that Strauss directs towards Oppenheimer, he also kind of drops some lines. He makes the characters drop some line to the effect that you realize that atomic armament in itself is one of the pillars of the contemporary world, even the day you and I live in right now, where states could no longer risk open war. So they had to do proxy war, and that prevented big-ass cataclysmic wars like the Second World War, but also it locked the world in a kind of demonic maze of basically controllable proxy wars. And as these kind of developed in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, and as we see now in Ukraine, they kind of turned this into business in a very pragmatic and like demonically efficient way. So wars, like every day in the world, there's a war going somewhere in the background. It's all very neatly controlled. The region is controlled. Fuck you if you happen to live there. But other than that, for the rest of the world, it's a good day. It's business as usual. And through that inference, you can actually realize the kind of terrible state of inflation, the terrible state, the collusion between state power and corporate power and private power has gotten to these days. It derives most of its power from basically atomic weapons making big conventional conflict impossible. So now you have to compete in the political and the commercial arena. So you have to make more products and shit to sell to more people, and all of your products have to be shitty because they need to expire so you can sell more products, and it's a vicious never-ending cycle. How are you gonna break this cycle? I don't don't know, but as I said in one of the earlier side tangents in this review, maybe a massive expansion of state power under the military guys, maybe that will be it. And that could somehow like burst the cyst that has been collecting for at least 40 years now, since the 1970s. The world has been locked in this like bottom line shareholder capitalism cycle, basically, and that cycle is directly the reason for the predications many of us find ourselves in these days. And that cycle in turn was bolstered perhaps the most heavily by the world order and the military commercial order brought about by atomic weapons, who were invented by Oppenheimer himself. Anyways, everyone, that's my review for Oppenheimer, the film. As you probably realized, it wasn't totally a film review, but more of a state of the world review. Do you agree with my views or do you disagree with them? Let me know in the comments. As everybody knows, this is a channel where we don't beat down on people. We have no sword to sharpen, but only our thoughts to polish. And thanks for bearing with me, and I hope you watch and enjoy Oppenheimer. If you like Oppenheimer, also consider buying the book American Prometheus. Also, since you're in YouTube-verse, consider going over to, well, the YouTube search bar and just search for this amazing BBC TV miniseries called Oppenheimer. Just search for Oppenheimer BBC, and there you will find actually another really well done, amazing portrayal of Oppenheimer's life. I think if you like this film, you must also watch the BBC special. Just be quick, because any day now I think they're gonna remove it from YouTube. So there, these are Daddy Kozman's bombastic atomic Oppenheimer recommendations to you all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'm eating peaches now, and even for $1 a month, you could help me get more peaches. Bye, and I love you. Goodbye.